As the 1940s began, the United States was still feeling the effects of the Great Depression. Millions of unemployed Americans, like these construction workers in Florida, looked to the programs of President Franklin D. Roosevelt to restore jobs and a healthy economy. But in some other countries suffering from the Depression, leaders promised recovery and glory through military expansion. Led by Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany had attacked Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939. Pledged to support Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later, and World War II began. By 1941, the war had engulfed Europe as well as parts of Africa and Asia. Areas shown in orange indicate countries where Germany and Italy had taken control. Areas shown in green indicate countries under Japanese control. Although 2 oceans separated the United States from the fighting, President Roosevelt called for a military buildup. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the United States entered the war. 4 years of war would transform the United States from an isolationist nation to one deeply involved in international affairs. America paid a high price for participation in the war abroad. 300,000 dead and more than 600,000 wounded, more than 3 times the casualties suffered in World War I. At home, Americans rallied to support the war. Women went to work in factories to help produce arms and machinery. Victory in 1945 did not slow the nation's industrial buildup. Consumer goods, such as this car, began rolling off assembly lines as manufacturers went through the process of converting their factories from wartime production. But the larger world remained unsettled. To provide a forum for international cooperation, the United Nations was founded in 1945. This body faced a practically impossible task, dealing with the growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Known as the Cold War, this intense rivalry would continue for decades. In 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the first president elected to a 3rd term. Anxious Americans turned once again to Roosevelt as Germany overran much of Western Europe and Japan advanced into Asia. From England, Edward R. Murrow, a young American correspondent for CBS Radio, brought the horror of German air raids to his listeners at home.
This is London,
he began, with the sound of bombs dropping and anti-aircraft gunfire crackling around him. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, at left, shown here viewing damaged buildings in Britain, appealed to the United States for aid. Congress approved a plan devised by Roosevelt to lend arms to Britain, as well as his call for a military buildup. But isolationist sentiment kept the United States out of the war. That ended with the attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. Suddenly, America was at war. Here, new soldiers arrive in San Diego for basic training. Though World War II was a distant war, fought across 2 oceans, more than 15 million American men eventually served in the armed forces. Women also joined the military. More than 300,000 women served in special divisions of the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, as mechanics, code clerks, typists, truck drivers, and pilots. Women aided the war effort on the home front as well, by filling jobs traditionally held by men. Like this woman, many worked in defense industries and were celebrated as Rosie the Riveter in posters and song. American industries were called upon to produce equipment and arms for the nation and other Allied powers, especially Britain and the Soviet Union. Here, new cargo planes are readied for delivery. This woman is using ration coupons to buy groceries. As the demand for military supplies mounted, the government began rationing consumer goods. Gasoline was also rationed. By 1943, most Americans were limited to 3 gallons of gasoline a week. Americans planted home gardens called Victory Gardens to demonstrate their support for the war effort and to ensure a supply of fresh produce. To strengthen the wartime economy, the federal government issued war bonds and stamps, and posters urged patriotic Americans to buy them. As raw materials became scarce, Americans ransacked their homes and businesses for discarded pots, tin cans, even old tires, anything that could help the United States produce necessary weapons. Hollywood also boosted public support for the war. Movies, providing an escape from the sometimes bleak news from the front, showed handsome American soldiers outwitting villainous Japanese. The war against Japan led to intensified anti-Japanese racism in the United States. Although there was not one incident of sabotage, the government forced Japanese Americans, most of whom were United States citizens, to leave their homes and businesses on the West Coast and to settle in relocation camps in desolate areas of Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, and other states. The war raged on 2 fronts, both in Europe and the Pacific. In the Pacific, American servicemen struggled to oust the Japanese from the Philippines and many other islands. Here, the first wave of U.S. soldiers storms a Pacific island at daybreak. There were 50,000 American casualties in the battle for the island of Okinawa alone. America's Soviet allies sustained heavy losses, defending their western borders against Nazi Germany. Out of a population of approximately 100 million people, more than 20 million died in the war. After fighting through a brutal Russian winter, the Soviets forced the Germans to retreat in early 1943. This was a major turning point in the war. A second key offensive came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, when for the first time the Allies landed a massive unified force in Europe. Here, ships and tanks converge at Omaha Beach on the Normandy coast of France. D-Day marked another major victory in the war to free Europe from Nazi control. Despite his fragile health, President Roosevelt campaigned and was elected to a 4th term. Shown here with his new Vice President, Harry Truman, Roosevelt died in April 1945. His death shook the nation. Truman, a former senator from Missouri, had served a mere 3 months as Vice President. Berlin, Hitler's capital, fell only 3 weeks after Truman took office. Here, an American soldier greets a Russian soldier at the Elbe River, where British, Americans, and Soviets joined forces after their advances across Germany. As Allied forces penetrated into Germany, they discovered concentration camps, where Nazis had imprisoned and killed Jews from many European countries. This photo was taken when the Buchenwald camp was liberated. Nearly 6 million Jews, as well as millions of Soviet prisoners of war, gypsies, Poles, and others, died. A horrifying event that has come to be known as the Holocaust. Although fighting continued in the Pacific, on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Here, crowds cheer in New York's Times Square. On that day, the horrors of war had diminished, and the horrors of the nuclear age had not yet begun. A secret effort to develop an atomic bomb had been underway since 1940. Physicist Robert Oppenheimer, pictured here, led the project's team of scientists. Called the Manhattan Project, this research led to the development of the atomic bomb. The bomb gave the United States an unparalleled military superiority. Believing it was the only way to end the Pacific War quickly, Truman ordered the atomic bomb dropped on Japan. The bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Just 3 days later, another bomb leveled Nagasaki. The two cities were devastated. A Japanese survivor drew this picture of the sea of fire that engulfed her city on that horrible day. Those not killed in the blasts later suffered from their exposure to radiation. The Japanese surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. The war was over. This returning GI kissed American ground, and he was not alone in his happiness. Americans everywhere rejoiced. Many new technologies developed during the war had helped the Allies win. Named Colossus, this electronic computer invented by the British helped crack Nazi codes. Another major advancement was the development of a technique to produce large quantities of penicillin. Here, a lab worker monitors that production process. Antibiotics like penicillin, used to fight soldiers' infections, ushered in a new era in medicine. Returning soldiers benefited from new legislation called the GI Bill of Rights. It helped veterans find jobs and pay for their college educations or vocational training. The transition from wartime production to a peacetime economy was not without problems, but soon the auto industry and other industries producing consumer goods boomed. And the Federal Housing Administration made it possible for Americans to secure housing loans that required only small down payments. It became cheaper to buy a new home than to rent. Developers covered acre after acre with housing tracts, like this one on the outskirts of Los Angeles. These were the suburbs. After the war, products such as plastics and frozen foods became more widely available. So did kitchen appliances. Dishwashers, dryers, and garbage disposals made household work easier. Americans soon found themselves with greater prosperity and more time for sports and entertainment. One of the most popular crooners of the decade, Frank Sinatra, attracted teenage girls who swooned in the aisle. Truman won the presidential election in 1948. The election night results and Truman's inauguration were the first to be televised. Developed before the war, television heightened Americans' enthusiasm for entertainment and sports by bringing events into their homes. From their living rooms, American fans could now watch prizefighter Rocky Graziano knock out his opponents. Jackie Robinson, seen here sliding into third base, was the first black to play in the major leagues. Robinson's acceptance into the major leagues was a landmark in a segregated nation. So was President Truman's order to integrate the armed forces in 1947. During World War II and in previous wars, most American soldiers had belonged to all-black or all-white military divisions. In the late 1940s, as Europe struggled to rebuild, post-war tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grew. To counter Soviet influence, the United States instituted the Marshall Plan, which funneled loans and direct aid to many war-damaged European nations. The growing rivalry for control in Europe was an indication of the deep division that came to be known as the Cold War. Berlin, once the capital of Germany, became after the war a city divided into sectors by the Allies. In 1948, the Soviets sealed off all land routes to West Berlin, which lay within the Soviet sector of Germany. The United States responded with an airlift of food and supplies to West Berlin. After 15 months, the Berlin blockade ended, but the Cold War had begun in earnest. In 1949, the United States learned that the Soviet Union had developed its own atomic bomb. No longer did the United States enjoy uncontested military superiority. The destructive power of the atomic bomb cast a pall on the future of humankind. Nevertheless, America's newfound prosperity held great promise for the future. Despite their growing fear of the Soviet Union, Americans had begun the baby boom, the greatest period of population growth in their history. Americans ended the decade with confidence.